On January 8, 1962, Clarence Earl Gideon mailed his handwritten petition to the United States Supreme Court. What he didn't realize was the national impact that this would have on the country forever. Clarence Earl Gideon was born on August 30th, 1910, in the town of Hannibal, Missouri. At the age of 14, he ran away from home with nothing but his 8th grade education. He spent most of his young life as a drifter, who was in and out of jail due to his mother and others and their need to incarcerate Clarence for small, nonviolent crimes. In June of 1961, Clarence, at age 51, was arrested for breaking and entering the Bay Harbor Pool Hall in Panama City, Florida. He could not afford a lawyer, so on August 4, 1961, he asked the circuit judge for his right to free counsel. The Florida judge stated the only time the court can appoint counsel to represent a defendant is when that person is charged with a capital offense. After the United States Supreme Court case of Betts v. Brady, judges were given considerable discretion in appointment of counsel for defendants. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, which was the maximum sentence permissible under Florida law. While in prison, Clarence began to study law because of his belief of the violation of his personal rights. He discovered his case related to the Sixth Amendment of the United States Constitution, which stated, "In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to have the assistance of counsel for his defense." Clarence filled out a habeas corpus petition, which is a petition for release from unjust imprisonment, and submitted it to the Florida Supreme Court. They turned it down, so Joseph Peel, Clarence's cellmate and ex-lawyer, helped Clarence write a petition to the United States Supreme Court. Peel understood the Supreme Court was trying to overrule Betts v. Brady. Therefore, he knew Clarence had a better chance of having his case heard at the national level. In the beginning of 1963, the United States Supreme Court decided to review his case. There were many things happening in America at this time. The United States was currently in the middle of the Vietnam and Cold War. Civil rights gained attention, and Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, and NASA launched their first satellite into space. The case started on January 15, 1963, and was led by Chief Justice Hugo Black. Represented by lawyer Abe Fortas, Clarence walked into the courtroom spilling coins and put an empty bottle of wine on the prosecutor's table. He said, "There were times in prison when I felt like my life wasn't worth the pile of change or the bottle of hooch I was accused of stealing. But every man has a right to his dignity and due process of law. I was deprived of both when I had to go at it alone in court to defend myself against a felony charge with a 5-year prison sentence." The defense was led by Louis L. Wainwright, who was born on September 11, 1923, and was Secretary of the Florida Division of Corrections from 1962 until 1987. He was most famous for being the named respondent in 2 U.S. Supreme Court cases, Gideon v. Wainwright and Ford v. Wainwright. On March 18, 1963, the United States Supreme Court decided the outcome of Gideon v. Wainwright. The case held, confirming that assistance of counsel is a fundamental right essential to a fair trial. Gideon's conviction was reversed. 2 years after Gideon's conviction, the case was retried, represented by counsel, and Gideon was acquitted of all charges. Gideon v. Wainwright was one of a series of Supreme Court decisions that confirmed the right of defendants in criminal proceedings, upon request, to have counsel appointed both during trial and on appeal. In the subsequent cases of Messiah v. United States and Miranda v. Arizona, the Supreme Court further extended the rule to apply even during police interrogation. Having the right to an attorney is now part of the Miranda rights. Justice Hugo Black summed up Clarence's case by stating, "He lacks both the skill and knowledge adequately to prepare his defense, even though he has a perfect one. He requires the guiding hand of counsel at every step in the proceedings against him. Without it, though he will be found guilty, he faces the danger of conviction because he does not know how to establish his innocence." Because of Gideon v. Wainwright, the United States Supreme Court recognized that lawyers in criminal courts are necessities, not luxuries. The right to counsel should be guaranteed in the state criminal process. This case had a profound impact on the operation and aspirations of the American criminal justice system. The Justice Department is committed to working to ensure that the goals and visions of Gideon v. Wainwright are fully and finally realized. The Supreme Court held that the framers of the Constitution placed a high value on the right of the accused to have the means to put up a proper defense, and the state as well as federal courts must respect that right. The court held that it was consistent with the Constitution to require state courts to appoint attorneys for defendants who could not afford to retain counsel on their own. The Supreme Court ruled that legal assistance is fundamental and essential to a fair trial, and that due process requires states to provide a lawyer for any impoverished person being prosecuted for a serious crime. Today, states and localities make use of a variety of systems to provide impoverished defense, from state and county-based public defenders to appointment systems that reimburse private attorneys who represent impoverished defendants. It's not often that the Supreme Court comes to a unanimous decision, but Gideon v. Wainwright was one of those cases. To put into perspective, Brown v. Board of Education was another unanimous decision. Robert F. Kennedy noted that if Gideon hadn't written the letter, the vast machinery of American law would have gone on functioning undisturbed. 51 years after the Gideon v. Wainwright decision, significant progress has been made, although there is still a long way to go to provide quality criminal defense services to all. These defense services vary widely across states and localities. Gideon realized throughout his life there were times he was challenged of his personal rights as a citizen of the United States of America, although he never realized the issue of the underrepresentation of his rights would force the government to realize their responsibilities in maintaining a person's individual rights.